Yona put Kiva Nook. Hey everyone, let's start healing. I'm Adrienne Murchison and welcome to episode 21 of the Let's Start Healing podcast. Yona put Kiva Nook. Can you guess that language? I greeted you with good day in Hungarian. And guess why? You know why. We have more in common than we think. And what we have in common can change the world. A few weeks ago, a friend paid me the ultimate compliment when it comes to this podcast. He said that if anyone was in search of a spiritual path and they were to listen to the episodes of Let's Start Healing, they would realize that any path they choose is the right one, because they would see this from the variety of guests that we have on this show. And I just can't ask for more than that, for people to be receptive to these episodes that bring people from all different faiths and all different backgrounds talking about their spiritual path in love. That's just the greatest. So we have some surprises in the coming weeks related to different modes of spiritual practice, because I know each of us, we get to our Zen place in different ways, and we're going to present some of that. In the meantime, I would love for you to send me an email and briefly, in a nutshell, tell me how you define spirituality. What does that word mean to you? I've learned from our many guests that so many of us have a different definition of spirituality. And then many people don't use that word very much at all because they're more aligned with traditional religion. So however you define it, I would love for you to share that with me. Send me an email at letstarthealingpodcast@gmail.com. Also, remember to like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram. And all of our episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and our YouTube channel, all under Let's Start Healing Podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Laura Tad, and she is very spiritual as well as an astrologer by profession. I just can't wait for you to meet her. I love chatting with Laura because she brings her academic education, professional expertise, and her spirituality together to form her understanding and truth around astrology. She has a Ph.D. in human science, and she is a consultant in astrology and sees clients at the spa at Serenbe, which is an intentional community, if you're not familiar with it, in Chattahoochee Hills, Georgia. She also sees or talks to clients remotely through Skype and on the phone all over the world. So I am just really, as I said, excited for you to meet her. She explains so much in this episode about astrology. And believe me, I tried to cover a lot for you skeptics out there. So I am sure you're going to enjoy this. As a matter of fact, we are going to have a series around astrology on Let's Start Healing. Laura is one of the guests in this series that you'll meet today. So let's meet her. Let's get started and let's start healing. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
I think some people, even if they don't believe in astrology, they're still curious and intrigued.
Sure. Yeah.
They may not want to admit it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason everybody reads the horoscope in the newspaper, right?
Yes. So I want to get into how you got into astrology, a little bit about your background and your education.
So I was raised by parents that are clairvoyants for a living.
Really?
So, and hippies, right? So astrology was sort of always around since I was tiny.
In Boston, did you, or where was this?
Just out, Western Mass, so near Amherst, Mass. So
Okay.
sort of, more out in the country. But yeah, just I was steeped in spirituality and alternative, more new agey spiritualities my whole life. My parents knew some astrology. That was a little bit of the language was always around, but neither of them are astrologers. But so it was always sort of around. And then, sort of as happens as a child trying to differentiate yourself from your parents, I was finding my own way. Right? I didn't want to do their thing or, and so it took a little bit of time to sort of embrace it for myself because I didn't want to be like them because like all kids, right? They don't want to.
But did you find that you had some gifts as you were a teenager?
I did,
and young adult?
But I also dismissed a lot of it because being a kid, so much of the challenge of being a kid is trying to fit in. And I was the first kid in my class whose parents got divorced and I have a learning disability. And so it was like, oh, one more thing to make me different. I'm not going to talk about it and didn't till I was in my early 20s. And even then, like just dipped a toe and like was only comfortable at all because I had a dear friend at the time and roommate, and he had just gotten back from India teaching English to Tibetan refugee children. And I was like, oh, okay, you're safe to talk to about this. And I won't be weird and you're open to it, even if it's not entirely your thing, you're curious. And so that felt like a safe space. And so finally sort of from there, slowly started exploring it. But with astrology, it really wasn't till I had gone to college and dropped out of college and went back to college and moved across the country and was when I moved to Santa Barbara, California, I was in a women's group that was using astrology to sort of help explain what was going on in the lives and in the group.
Oh.
And in my doctoral thesis, I talked about it sort of like being bit by the acting bug. Right? I just got hooked and it became...
This was in where were you living then?
In Santa Barbara, California.
Okay.
And so, I was in college, had for the third time after having dropped out multiple times and joined this group that a friend of mine was in and then ended up creating an independent studying astrology for college credit. Because the group was run by a woman who was a psychologist, so she could serve as, the mentor and official, teacher for doing a college level course and finagled my way out. I mean, even though in the student handbook, they said that you couldn't do independent studies on things such as astrology. It was their one example of what I couldn't do an independent study on. But I called it symbolic systems and got away with it.
Get out of here.
3 units of credit for studying astrology in college, calling it symbolic systems. Because that's a lot of my training with it is looking at it from a Jungian psychology, archetypal perspective and story. And what are the stories that are being told? The root of the word astrology is the language of the stars.
And so what were you learning? I mean, actually, I was thinking about Greek mythology when you just said that. Is that...
That's very much, Greek and Roman mythology. Right now, for the last several centuries, the planets have all been named after Roman gods, but they were named after Greek gods earlier in human history and Egyptian gods as well. And the planets remain the same. So Isis and Aphrodite and Venus are all the goddess of love. One's Egyptian, one's Greek, one's Roman. It was the same planet. It was the same star they were identifying in different cultures. It just changed names based on sort of the ruling language, ruling government, whatever power, governing power was sort of in charge. But the identification of the planet didn't change. So, Mercury is Mercury now. Well, he was called Hermes in Greece, but it's the same star.
Oh, okay.
It's the same planet and similar mythologies.
And so as you're learning about the planets, you're learning what they represent.
Yeah, I mean, part of how, particularly the planets through Saturn, because those are the ones that you can easily see with the naked eye, right, without a telescope. So those are the ones that, since early days in humans, people were tracking their movements. And so they named them by observation, by observing it, and then saying, okay, well, what's happening? And going, oh, well, every time this star is here, this is happening, and that's like our story of this god or goddess. And so they evolved. They were named in part because of observing what was happening, and it mirrored these existing stories.
Can you give an example? I kind of know what you're talking about.
Well, so looking at the alignment of Mars and Venus, right? And okay, well, Mars is the god of action, of drive, of war. Venus is the goddess of love. In mythology, they're the archetypal lovers. They're not married, but they're lovers. And that energy, people were more frisky whenever Mars and Venus were closer in the sky. That intensified, and they would make those connections, say, oh, well, this is like these myths we have, you know, or, I mean, Venus gets very complicated because she can be a morning star or evening star. And so she changes some of what she means that way. So morning star meaning like the star rises before the sun. So you can see the star of Venus early in the morning because it's rising before the sun does. And or night Venus, and evening star, and you don't see it till after the sun sets.
So you're saying star and not planet?
Well, because yeah, I mean the planet Venus, but she's referred to as morning star or evening star because that's how we see it with the naked eye, right? We're not seeing a blue ball without a telescope. But so she's just referred to, you know, stars are used interchangeably, and sort of like with astrologers too, they'll refer to planets, and that will include the sun and moon.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
It's like, oh, well, that's, you know, some people get more specific and say luminaries to identify sun and moon. But really, you know, people are like, oh, well, the planets, any astrology book that's talking about planets, they'll include sun and moon in that language typically.
Okay, so gosh, there's so much I want to ask you about. So first of all, I want to stay with your education because you studied this. I mean, you're educated in this.
Yeah, I mean, I am self-taught. I studied with various other astrologers, and go to regular conferences, which is just, it's like going to summer camp. It's super fun. You know, it's like, it's my tribe. I get to go and see, you know, there's ones I go to annually, and it's people that live in different parts of the world. And it's like, oh, I get to see them annually. It's like, I'm not going to be able to get to London and Vancouver, Canada, and Mexico to see people I know. Right. It's like, oh, right, we can spend one weekend together and see everybody. And so I've done, you know, so going to conferences has been an education with astrology. And then academically, I went kind of traditional route of, you know, college, graduate school, and ended up getting a Ph.D.
In what area?
So my doctorate is in human science. So it's an interdisciplinary social science degree. So it's psychology, sociology, philosophy, cultural study, interwoven together. Because I only know how to think interdisciplinarily. Like that's the way my brain works. Everything is interconnected. I can't be tunnel vision track doesn't work for the way that I see the world. Right. And then so for my master's thesis, I wrote on the ancient history of astrology, sort of Babylon through the early Arab Empire, so the fall of Rome, and sort of about to like the Dark Ages is what we talk about. And then for my doctoral thesis, I interviewed 6 astrologers about what it's like to have a career in a culture, in a society that puts little to no value in what you do.
Oh my.
And what has that been like? And what drew them to it, and what keeps them going with it when, you know, by and large, it's not a respected field.
Right.
At least in this part of the world. If you're in India, it would be a totally different conversation. But in this part of the world, it's scoffed at. It's thought of as, not true or scamming or all of that. And so why people go into this field, despite all of that, right? Or in spite of all of that.
Do you think that's changing a little bit?
I do. Yeah. I mean, I think it ebbs and flows to some degree, but it's absolutely, whenever they do sort of big polls about the percentage of people that believe in astrology, the numbers historically keep ticking up.
Yeah.
And it's a booming industry, so clearly there's people that believe in it, or you wouldn't have it in every newspaper and every magazine and and online now with it. It's just it's all over the internet.
Why do you think that the history, like when you refer back to like ancient times, why do you think that's so prevalent in how that can affect our day-to-day lives now?
Well, because it still holds true. Right? So yes, they made these observations, 10 BC, but it's, to me, part of what gives it validity is that it still holds up. 3 centuries later, 3 millennia later, it still holds up. It still works. And that, to me, is part of what gives it validity. And sometimes it can be a different way of looking at the world. It still holds up. I mean, it's just like, I have a friend who's an astrologer. She's constantly saying, you can't make this stuff up. Like the way that it directly lines up and things happen. And it's like, we're not controlling the movement of the planet.
Right.
It's just this observation. Oh, wait, every time this happens, this is going on.
And the thing for me too is the energy.
Sure.
I mean, and is this, the way I think of it is, if everything is energy, and if the moon controls the ocean.
Yeah. And so there's different arguments. I mean, some people talk about it there being a physical energy from a physics, sort of more traditional physics perspective of the moon controls the tides, or our bodies are 75% water. Of course, we're impacted by the moon. Right. Is one of the
That's
arguments.
That's just one
of the planets.
And I just see that as one type of energy.
Yeah. So there is that argument. And people say, but Pluto is so far out. How are we possibly being impacted by the gravitational impact of a planet that is light years away? But from a metaphysical perspective, that's very much a part of how I view astrology. Not all astrologers do, but my perspective and a lot of my colleagues is like, if you don't have a spiritual perspective of it, none of it means anything. Like, what gives it power and beauty and why it's helpful to people as opposed is the spiritual component.
Right.
And the European Renaissance, one of the theories, because astrology had a resurgence then after sort of disappearing, like a lot of thought did for 500 years, is that the soul falls through the planets on the way to Earth and absorbs the energy of the planets.
Oh.
That was one of their theories.
That's kind of beautiful.
Yeah. And I don't know that I subscribe to that, but it is sort of this explanation that they were coming up with. Well, why is it? They were trying to understand why it worked. And that was their argument.
And so what is your, how did you grow up spiritually? Like, what was your idea of God in your home and now?
Parents that were clairvoyants for a living, it was sort of a hodgepodge of belief systems. A lot of Eastern, so my dad today, anyway, would identify as a Buddhist.
He's clairvoyant in what way?
He sees chakras, he sees auras, he sees visions. He has a clairaudence. So clairvoyant is seeing things. Clairaudient is hearing things. So he has that experience too. Both my parents used to go into trance regularly, but it's physically hard on the body. And so my dad stopped a long time ago because he has asthma, and he found that going into trance would trigger his asthma. But so they, see visions. My mom, instead of palmistry, she sees sort of a movie in somebody's palm of their
No
hand.
kidding.
And yeah, so I sort of grew up in that world. And, as a small child being told that, oh, well, your imaginary friend is an ghost, is an entity from your last life who's hanging around you. So that was not, at the time, that was normal. I mean, that was all I knew.
Right.
And everything I was exposed to, it's like, people are always, it's like, I don't want to name drop, but I'm like, the reality is like, yeah, I knew some of the biggest spiritual teachers out there. It's like, my dad is friends with Bob Thurman, who is one of the foremost Buddhist scholars in the country.
Oh.
And it's like, yeah, we would go to his house when I was a kid, when he still taught at Amherst College. And I think he's at Columbia now. But it's like, yeah, that was just the world I was in. And so I think, in terms of the concept of God, I don't know that it was more sort of a universal spiritual spirit was more of the language that was used than God. My dad was raised Catholic. So, we sort of would go to church with my grandma for Easter and Christmas. It was sort of, that would, to appease her in part. But, there wasn't a dismissing of Christianity. It was like, oh, it's one of many paths to God or connecting with source.
Do you have a spiritual practice? Is it meditation or?
I have my own sort of hybrid piece now where it's like, yeah, meditation and, even astrology can have a spiritual component.
Right.
And bringing in spirituality to that, or just a variety of different tools. I've got runes that I use, or
what's a rune?
So they're the rocks that are from the Celtic culture that are sort of their version, for lack of a better, of like a tarot card, but it's a little different. And I don't use those professionally. I just use them for myself. But it's part of a spiritual thing, and it's like, yeah, I gathered the rocks on the beach in Ireland and made my own, and so they have a real I have a spiritual relationship with them. So yeah, in terms of meditation, or it's like trying to integrate that in spirituality into the everyday, rather than, oh, well, I'm spiritual when I go to a service of some kind.
Right. So let's talk about like when a person is born and how that's meaningful, where they were born and what time they were born.
Yeah. So with Western astrology, which is, because there's the primary astrologies that are used are Western and Vedic, right? So Vedic is what they use in India, and it's calculated differently.
Okay.
But so what most people in this country know, right, and what's sort of thought of, and by shorthand is even just called astrology, is, so you are using to gather the data or calculate the data of a chart, and you basically draw a picture, or the software now draws a picture. I don't have to do it right. Is using the time of day somebody was born, the location, so because you calculate longitude and latitude within that, and the date, so full birth day, month, day, year, and you basically get a graphic picture of where every planet was from the perspective of Earth the minute you were born. So what was above the horizon, which is why you need location, right? And time of day. Was it noon? Is the sun at the top of the chart? Or was it 2:00 in the morning and the sun's at the bottom of the chart because the sun had set and you can't see it? And where within this wheel that each planet falls, so they're sort of spinning through the wheel over the course of the day, right? It's like a clock. It's moving through this wheel.
Now, is this the way that I'm perceiving this, is that it as energy, and that energy is always, it doesn't stay in one spot forever.
Sure.
Energy shifts. That's the way is that correct?
But it's also the physical location of the planet is
right
moving from our perspective on Earth. It's rising and setting in relation to our horizon. So that's how it's moving through this wheel.
And that's how I'm thinking of, I want to know, am I correct or off on this? So I'm thinking what you're saying, I'm translating that into, well, as it moves, the energy of that planet is moving to another.
Absolutely. Yes. In a chart, there's 12 pieces of a pie, basically, right? And this wheel, or they can think of it as spokes, right? And it creates 12 sections. And each of those 12 sections govern different areas of our life, right? So it could be our career, it could be family, it could be partnership, it could be friendship. And so as the planets move throughout the day through these different sections of this wheel, then where a given energy is most dominant changes, right? So let's say Venus is the planet of love. Well, for one person, let's say they were born in it, two people born in Atlanta on the exact same day, but they're born 12 hours apart.
Okay.
Right. So for one person, what they love and value may show up the most in their life in relationship to family. And that's what's most important to them. And somebody born 12 hours earlier in the day, their career would be what was most important to them.
And that's because of where the planet was and go ahead.
Yeah, within that wheel. So even though they're very close in birth, where that, they're 12 hours apart, they have the same birthday. Where that, what they love and value becomes the most significant for them, that energy of that plays out differently.
And so they may be very similar, because I'm Taurus, so I might meet a Taurus woman and we'll be very similar, but where we place our attention on love may be different. Could be career for me, family for me, or
Tauruses are typically very loyal, right? And to your own detriment.
Yes, true that.
And aesthetic is often really important to Taurus. The sensory world is really important to Tauruses. How things feel, taste, touch, all of that can impact sort of how comfortable you are in your own skin. Right. But where it can, and there's layers of how it can have variance and vary, from person to person. But with what we're talking about of sort of just the time of day, where that plays out, where you're the most loyal, is that with family? Is that with friends? Is that with career? Is that to yourself?
Right.
So that's where, the weekly or daily horoscopes are not
useful.
Yeah, I mean, there's some information there that's helpful, but there's a reason that they're written so generally, because you can't write them in a way that would apply to every Taurus, right? I've written them, and and so when the horoscopes are looking at, okay, well, how is that sign in general being impacted that day? But there's 30 days that sign exists every year. And there's so many varying ways, right? And we have free will.
Right. I wanted to ask you about that.
So, as a Taurus, it's like, well, Tauruses can be super loyal. They can be super stubborn. Right, it can be the bull that is not going to be moved, because the bull is the animal, is the image, the iconography, the image of Taurus is the bull, and the degree to which that Taurus energy manifests as loyal and connected with the earth and animals and nature, and the degree to which it's stubborn and unmoving and fixed in ways of being in the world, there's free will.
Yeah. So how does that play into it? Because that's what, someone could say, a skeptic could say, well, I have free will. This doesn't mean anything.
There's free will, but it's like, well, it's the degree to which you're stubborn versus the degree to which you are yielding, right? That's where the free will comes in. But it's like you only get so many options. If it's a multiple choice test, right? It's
right.
Like, okay, yeah, you have choice, but only so many choices. Not everybody gets the same choices.
Mm-hmm.
So that's part of how I see it, to play it of like.
So the framework is going to be what the framework is, and you have choices within that framework.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then now we also have the ascendant and descendant. So you're born a certain sign, under a certain sign, and then you have an ascendant sign and a descendant sign.
And that's
right?
what, and that is what's determined both by time of day and location, because what the ascendant is the part of, or rising, it's used interchangeably, is the part of the sky that was on the horizon the minute you were born.
Okay.
So that's why time and location becomes so important to calculate a chart, is, well, what's the longitude and latitude of the city you were born in? Because that's what's going to change where everything falls in that wheel. So
that would be different often from the sign you're in, not always.
It would only be the same if you were born at sunrise.
Okay.
Or within an hour or two of sunrise.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, it is different.
And so what do those mean? Your ascendant sign means what? Your descendant sign means what?
And the descendant is just the exact opposite, right? It's the polar opposite of so it's still part of the horizon. It's just the invisible, right? It's the polar opposite sign of the horizon. So the exact bottom of the sky, basically. So the sun the sun sign, which is what most people know, right? So you're a Taurus. Your sun's the sign the sun was in is your sun sign,
right?
And that is thought of as sort of our general core identity, how we self-identify, our sort of sense of self. And whereas the ascendant is how we present ourselves, how we are perceived, people's initial impressions of us. It can be, sometimes it's referred to in psychology language as our persona, right? Sort of the mask we wear. And so unless you're born within an hour or two of sunrise, your ascendant's a different sign. And so that's often when, people perceive you to be very different than you are. Or if someone's like, oh, guess my sign. You're more likely to guess the ascendant because that's how they're presented.
Unless they really know you.
Yeah, unless you really know somebody, then you know them.
Right.
Right, but how they present, and it is part of our personality. It can be, when it being the persona, it's like, well, it's the mask we wear when you don't want people to see Taurus. You play your ascendant.
Okay.
That can feel more comfortable to put out into the world.
Right. You know what? I think that's true. I'm a Libra ascendant.
Yeah. And so people can assume you are more accommodating than you are. Because the Taurus doesn't really want to accommodate people all that much. And the Libra is all about accommodation.
Right. And
so people can be shocked sometimes when they think you're going to yield and you don't.
Right.
And it doesn't mean you aren't, it can help soften some of that Taurus energy when you have that combination. It's like, okay, well, maybe you're not as unyielding as you might have been if you had a Capricorn ascendant and being a Taurus. Yeah, you're not going to yield with that combination. But yeah, so that's where they end up, there's this interplay between and finding that, part of the work internal, the spiritual work is like, so how do you live with both those parts of yourself? That there's one part of you that wants to be accommodating, that's the peacemaker, that's the negotiator, that's the mediator, all of that Libran energy. When you really want it to be how you want it to be, and
right.
And so the spiritual work for the self with that is like, so navigating that, and okay, well, when do you yield and not feel resentful? Right?
When do you honor yourself?
And when do you honor, or when is yielding honoring yourself?
Right.
And it may not have seemed that way initially, right? So, because we're all here doing work. That's part of how I work with clients and look at astrology is like, well, what's the big work for the self you've come to do? There's also, okay, well, what have you come to contribute to the planet? Why, what are you here to add to the world? But from a personal perspective, okay, well, what's your work? Where is your edge of growth? and that there's a spiritual component to that,
Mm-hmm.
or it's all kind of spiritual, really. And because I look at it from what's the soul's work? What are you doing at a soul level? And what is your soul trying to work through? And so that's the big work that we're doing.
And then what's the descendant?
So the
representing?
descendant is the exact opposite. That has a lot to do with partnership. And so
Oh, really?
the kind of person, both in terms of romantic, intimate relationships, and then really good friends and sometimes business partners show up in that. But that's about this, so the self versus other, right? You think of the ascendant is about the self, the descendant is about other people. And so really significant other people in your life, and whatever sign that is. So for you, Aries, being a Libra ascendant, then the significant people in your life having those Aries, so being super driven, right? It's like, whether that's super close friends, a partner, it's like if they don't have that drive energy, it's like you don't want to bother. It doesn't matter how kind they are. It's like that's the must have for you.
Yeah. It's so funny. I bet that I can't imagine you having a client that says, no, that's not true about me.
It's very rare. And when I have encountered it, it has been because they're being defensive often. I worked with a woman several years ago who had come in, and she was trying to figure out work, and she had just quit a job, and she wanted to see what she could be doing. What does she need to do to get another job? And I was looking at her chart, and I said, well, and she had quit her job quick, like sort of rashly. And looking at her chart, I said, yeah, well, I think what you need to be careful of in looking for work in the future is I said, I think you could have talked to your boss and come up with something that would have worked for you, and being careful to not overreact. And her response was to stand up and ask for her money back and say, I don't overreact.
Did she sit back down, or
No,
she left?
She left.
Wow.
So yeah, generally speaking, people feel like, it resonates. And yeah, when it doesn't, it's either it pushes because it's pushing buttons, so it's something they don't want to hear about themselves. And sometimes some of our astrology is linked with things that we're working on and needing to learn.
Yeah.
And so that can be sometimes why people don't resonate with it, or require sort of more unpacking.
Right.
On my part I worked with a woman recently who's a Sagittarius, and typically Sagittarians love adventure, love travel. And she's like, oh no, I can't stand travel. And as we talked more, it's anxiety producing for her to travel with her family, but if she's on her own, that's when she's happiest. Oh. And so it's like she heard travel and she went immediately into the chaos of a family vacation. And so it did resonate. She just was hearing it in a very specific way.
Right.
And so, yeah, sometimes it can require a little bit of sort of, well, okay, what of that do you resonate with? And maybe how I'm communicating it isn't how the other person is hearing it.
And so what about like the moon? Because then your moon is something, there's so much stuff that plays into this. The houses.
Planet was somewhere. There's asteroids too that get even more complicated. Typically, there's only about half a dozen asteroids that astrologers use because there's thousands.
Okay. So the ones that you use are helpful enough.
Yeah. I think the other ones are just sort of fun to play with sometimes. I think they all can bring in a little bit of information sometimes. But yeah, you could, it's literally thousands and thousands and thousands of asteroids that have been named. And you can calculate where they were in the sky. It's all just math. But it's, it can be sometimes just too much information. I play with it sometimes for fun of like, oh, the Laura asteroid, which there is, happens to be right near where the sun was when I was born. So I don't think my parents had a choice but to name me Laura. So sometimes I do that just sort of for fun with friends. But yeah, the primary ones that are used do add things. They also help balance the fact that for the most part, all the planets are named after male gods, with the exception of Venus. And Juno, Vesta, Ceres, they're all female goddesses. So it helps to balance that.
And so those female goddesses relate to what?
They're all different things. They all, like the planets, they all represent different things.
Okay.
They're Roman goddesses. Juno is Hera in Greek mythology. So she was, Zeus's wife or Jupiter's wife. So it's bringing in just more nuance. But yeah, so every planet was somewhere. They all move at different speeds. Right. So often people will ask, who know a little bit about astrology, will ask for sun, moon, and rising, because that's what's going to change the fastest.
And the moon represents what?
So the moon changes every 2.5 days. Right. So it goes all the way through the zodiac from new moon to new moon. In a 28-day cycle. It's going through the whole zodiac. And it represents our emotions. Moon is mom, or oftentimes to refer to, it's like the parent that you would run to for support. So they're getting better in terms of not being so binary gender-wise. Of that could be dad, or if it's a same-sex couple, could be they may have 2 dads. Which one's moon? Which one, or 2 moms? And the moon governs how it feels to be alive. Right. So in some ways, our lived experience of being alive is more like our moon sign than our sun sign, because it's how we feel. And
if we don't feel that thing, if we don't feel what that represents, does that represent work we might need to do, or what's going on in your life?
It's how you process emotion, how you emotionally engage with the world. That there's a lot of, to use psychology language, shadow work with the moon, for sure, because most of us are walking around pretty repressed emotionally. And so that can be part of that, can be where that shows up too.
When you were describing the moon, I couldn't help but think about women and their monthly cycle.
Sure, absolutely.
And you said mom, and that's a lot of synchronicity to me.
It used to be before, in antiquity, in ancient times, for the most part, women's cycles were aligned with the cycles of the moon. Right. And then modern life has changed that. But yeah, and there's a astrologer I know in Australia who she's done a whole bunch of stuff with astrology and fertility, and being able to track fertility, a large part using the moon, to help women conceive.
And so the houses. So we have all of this, and then the houses are really important, aren't they?
So the houses are those 12 pieces of pie in the wheel, and that's where each of the 12 houses represent different areas of life. So the self, your money, your resources, how you communicate, family, creative projects, health, right? They all represent different areas of life. And so that's what, throughout the course of the day, all the planets are sort of spinning clockwise through this wheel all day long, right? It goes all the way around each day. In this, what part of the sky is it? Because Western astrology is geocentric. It's from our perspective on Earth. It's not, we acknowledge the fact that the sun is the center of the universe, but it doesn't appear that way to us on Earth. Right.
Because we're in it.
We're on it. So to us, the sun is going around us. Venus is going around us. Mars is going around us. That's not true. But that's our perception. Right. And that can be some of the tricky things of where astrology gets sort of attacked sometimes by people that don't understand that astrology acknowledges the astronomy of the fact that the sun's the center of the universe, but that's not how we perceive it from Earth. And it's all, if we someday move to Mars as a human race, you could recalculate charts based on being on Mars.
Right.
From a Martian perspective,
Right.
everything's moving around Mars.
Okay.
And so, yeah, the houses are where, that's why time gets really important to cast a chart. I mean, I can do a chart without the time. I cast it for sunrise usually. But I can't be as specific because I don't know where
the house is.
I don't know where anything falls. With the houses are locked. The first house is always in the same place, but is that going to be in Libra? Is it going to be in, what's the sign that's governing it? What planet's there changes over the course of the day.
So we have a fixed chart, am I right, from when we're born?
Exact fixed moment in time.
Right.
Time, date, and place of birth.
Right. And then there's all these other aspects, which is transit that we're talking about that takes place.
So, so a transit is comparing where things were when we were born to now or any other point in time. Where you could look at, what was going on 5 years ago when all that stuff happened.
Yeah.
And so you can compare what was in the sky 5 years ago to when you were born and sort of see, okay, well, what was that about? Or coming up, right? What's going to be going on in a year or 6 months, and so that can be more preparatory, right? When I work with some folks, I think that can be helpful. It's like, even if it's a year, 2 years out, and I'm like, well, really big shift in 2 years around career. Okay, well, start laying the groundwork, because if stuff's going to really change, get ducks in a row now, because then it's less chaotic. Right. So it can be a way of sort of preparing for things. Or if I'm looking at right now with somebody and they're having a particularly difficult time, seeing, okay, well, when's it going to ease up? Right. And that when you're really going through it, where it's like you just don't feel like there's no end to the tunnel, there's no light. Right. And being able to say, yeah, it's a year, but then you're good. Even when it's that long, it's like I've watched clients just drop and exhale, and it's like, right, it's not forever. Even if it's a year, when you're stuck in the tape of forever, right? A year feels like, I can do a year. That's okay. I was thinking a decade, like a year, easy.
So, and how many houses are there?
12.
12 houses.
So 12 houses, 12 signs, right? They're the same. They're in relationship to each sign.
Okay. Right. And just to name some of them, like you said, there's house or home.
I mean, they're called the first house, second house.
Right. But what they represent.
So the first house is about the self. The second house is about personal resources. So that often culturally is thought of as money, but it can just be too, like, what are your resources? What are your innate skills that you've come into the world with? That's a resource. Third house is about communication and siblings. Fourth house is home and family of origin, often more than the families we create as adults, because it deals with ancestry. So it's like where we come from. Okay. But it also, growing up, it's like childhood stuff often shows up in the fourth house. Fifth house is children, creative projects, love affairs. The sixth house is health and daily life, and places of service. The seventh house is partnership and marriage. The eighth house is about shared resources, right? So we start getting to have these polarities where the first house is about self, second house is about partnership and the other. Second house is personal resources, eighth house is shared resources. Okay. Right. So the other 12 are sort of similar to the first 6, but in a collective sense as opposed to an individual sense. Okay. Ninth house is higher education, higher ideals, higher minded, big concepts, big ideas, where the third house is about communication. The ninth house is more sort of thinking about all these ideas that you're talking about. 10th house is career. 11th house and sort of life's work. What are you here to contribute to the planet? Right. 11th house is hopes and wishes, aspirations, community, tribe, sort of things shows up there. So friends, but not really close friends, sort of like your social circle. Okay. Also, the 11th house can show areas of trauma that are I call it soul PTSD, where we have traumatic responses to things, even if rationally there's nothing that's really happened that's that extreme, but there can be that physiological traumatic response. Like people who are absolutely terrified of heights. There's nothing that's happened. It's this soul memory. It's this soul PTSD of, oh, maybe they died falling off a ladder in a past life, and it gets triggered. So that sort of thing can show up in the 11th house. And the 12th house is the most difficult to explain because it's about, or understand, because it's about the unconscious and the not tactile. It's about spirituality.
Okay.
But because it's not, there's nothing really solid about the 12th house. It's often the most difficult to grasp. Because it's about our unconscious, it's about what we don't know.
About what we don't know.
What we don't know, what we don't understand. It's about spirituality. It's about what's things often sort of textbooks too will list it as hospitals and prisons, but it's because it's about being removed from the world. Things that have you removed from society, removed from engaging with the world. And so that's often why it sort of lists those, but it's not about medical treatment or...
So it's not about a higher mind or higher consciousness.
It can be. I mean, that's part of that spirituality. Yeah.
Or it could be about a lower consciousness as well.
If you're unconscious, operating unconsciously.
Okay.
Right? That's where all of them, all planets, all signs, all houses sort of have these lower and higher manifestations. Right? You can be spiritually awakened or living unconsciously, and that's the 12th house. All of that's Pisces, all of that's Neptune. They're two sides of the same coin.
And Neptune is a planet I wanted to bring up when you were talking about Sagittarius or the client and travel, because I know when I've talked to you about Neptune, it's sort of seems like there's like I have to be, in relation to me, be careful because it could be overindulgent, or on the positive side, I could be something.
So you have Neptune in Sagittarius, maybe. It's generational,
I don't know.
So pretty much people born from about 71 to 85 have Neptune in Sagittarius.
I don't fall in that space. But it was something like maybe, like, on the one hand, I don't know, maybe something I'm doing something that really benefits me, but on the other hand, it was, well, be careful because I might just want to binge watch something and eat potato chips, something like that.
I'd have to see what that, I don't know. With just what that might have been, but I mean, that's where, everything can be done. So you probably have
two different extremes.
And that, with Sagittarius, it loves freedom and adventure, but that can be like never staying put. Never, right? It can be like too much in that.
I find, and this is a big generalization, I'm a baby, I'm an infant with astrology, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But I find Sagittarius people to be non-committal.
They can be.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean relationship, just period, just non-committal.
Well, I think that's that love of freedom. Right? And so it's like, well, if they have freedom within the commitment, then they're good. But they can be vulnerable to running, to bailing. Because they so are this, always seeking, when that they're not able to express that, at least in some part of their life. And it can reach that breaking point. And then like break all ties.
I'm out.
But and that's where looking at where every other planet is becomes so important, because somebody who's a Sagittarius who could struggle with commitment and sort of staying put, but then they have a whole bunch of stuff in Capricorn, well, that's going to offset that.
Because Capricorn's more about structure,
stable. It's an earth sign, right? So that grounds that energy. And so that can really be helpful. It's like one of my brothers has a whole bunch of stuff. Most of his chart is in a fire sign, and yet he's got a Capricorn rising, and it's sort of like, thank God. Because it has kept him grounded. Where, he's had a lot of luck and a lot of adventures, and he has been very successful, but he could have just been sort of, it's kept him in check and not get egoic that everything always goes his way. Right? It's like, oh, right, okay, still have to do the work.
Right.
It may always break in your favor, but because you put in the effort.
Right.
And rather than waiting for the universe to provide for him.
Yeah, yeah. And so is this correct that we have these nodes? And so like is it the southern node where you're sort of working on what you're here to do?
So north node is what you're here to do. So,
okay.
And they're the nodes of the moon. So every planet actually has nodes, but usually only the moon's nodes, the lunar nodes, are used. Because it's not an actual object. It's how the moon crosses. It's how the moon is lining up with Earth.
Okay.
Basically, is how and the sun. It's what calculates the nodes. And so like we've just had 2 eclipses in this last couple weeks, right? And so the alignment of the sun and the moon and Earth also meant that it was on top of the nodes, that it was aligned with the nodes. And so the south node is our past, is where we've come from. I think of it as like old hat, old comfy sweater, cup of tea. Like it takes no effort to engage with that energy or archetype. It's like, it's so familiar. Where the north node is more foreign. It's the opposite sign. And it's what we're working on, what we're working toward. And it doesn't mean we abandon the south node. But it's about going toward its polarity. What is it? Because all of that polarity, it's like, well, each sign has what the other needs to learn. Right? So Taurus, Scorpio, Taurus is stable and committed and loyal, but maybe stuck. And Scorpio is all about constant change and transformation. And so the Scorpio energy can help unstick the Taurian, but it could also be change for change's sake. And is needing to...
So you need balance.
Needs balance. It needs to ground and say, okay, change is great and transformation is great, but in the proper time. And that's what some of that Taurian energy can teach, that Scorpionic energy. So the nodes, and that's part of, the nodes get a lot into spirituality. Because it's about our soul's growth. What is the big work at a soul level that we're here to do? And for some people, that's an easier transition. And for other people, there's a lot of internal resistance around that can be unconscious, that can be psychological. And the chart can indicate too, how long have they been working on this? Right. Maybe it's like 4th lifetime that they've been trying to get there. And what's impeded their ability to make that transition, to shift that energy. And that in what's called evolutionary astrology, which is what really focuses a lot on the nodal polarities, they talk about, that you're working on this tension of these polarities because we keep reincarnating to work through their languages, the separating, returning desires to source.
Meaning that we're doing the same thing over and over again?
Well, that
we want to stop?
Internally, we both want to merge with the divine and individuate. Right? These separating, returning desires to source or to God. Right? We both want to return to God and no, I want to be my own being.
Right. And
that tension, that internal battle, and working through those internal resistances plays out with the nodes. And so that's these pieces. So what
that is so fascinating.
Within that of not being comfortable sort of with either option and sort of flip-flopping constantly.
That's so fascinating from my perspective in terms of spirituality because I'm thinking ego versus God.
Yeah.
And,
Yep,
being
exactly.
in
That could be a different
surrender.
way of looking at it.
Yeah. Everything you're saying to me relates to psychology, spirituality.
Yeah, so it could absolutely be God and ego,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Is, well, self versus collective.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that we want both, but they are not. How do they coexist?
Mm-hmm.
How do we both individuate and stay merged?
Right. Well, and it's a matter of accepting that that's possible, but we have it. And in that example, it's a mindset of, no, I can only do this thing if I'm an individual and I separate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do think that for these next couple centuries will be big. Because that's where, we've just moved into the age of Aquarius.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's debated a little bit as to exactly when we moved, that transition happened. Some people say 2012, some people say 2016, some people say 2005, right? But it's a 2,500 year period is an age.
What does that represent, the age of Aquarius?
So since roughly the birth of Christ, we've been in the age of Pisces. And so it meant at a global level, Pisces was a theme that the planet was working
and that
on.
Theme was?
So spirituality, which is we see with Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a lot of issues around unconsciousness and avoidance and escapism and that individuation, right? And trying to be God on earth, whether that was Jesus, but like popes, right? That sort of energy of like, oh no, I'm divine and you have to follow me sort of energy with a lot of that Piscean age. We're now just moving into the age of Aquarius that is about this. Aquarius deals with community in part and authenticity and this community, but individuation is a lot of what Aquarius is about as a sign. And, so how do we, what I think a lot of this next 2,500 year period will be is how do we acknowledge that we are all interconnected at a global level and yet not homogenize to the point that, let alone not even like at the individual level, but individual culture. We don't want we want to keep our cultures but still be united. Yeah. How do we maintain the diversity of the world from a cultural perspective and yet simultaneously acknowledge we're all the same and everybody's connected?
That's so fascinating in the context of the world today.
Yeah.
The country today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's why that's gotten up
exactly.
so much.
Exactly.
And we're in the early days of this focused energy of we don't want to homogenize. We don't want to have the beauty of the diversity of the cultures around the world disappear for the sake of harmony.
Right. And then it's not for that sake, by the way. Yeah. But yes.
That being the narrative.
Yeah.
Right. Is, well, if we all believed the same thing and then it would be okay. And if everybody looked relatively the same, then it would all be okay. Even if that was like, everybody's multiple mixed race.
Yeah.
That isn't the solution.
Right. I often think about just even 3 generations from now, what will it look like for, my relatives, the 25-year-old, 3 generations from now or 300 years from now,
I think we can forget how fast things change.
Yeah.
It's like my grandmother, she passed away 10 years ago now, but she was born in 1911 in Poland and died in her 90s.
Yeah.
And had a cell phone. And it's like what this woman saw in her lifetime.
Right.
Where it was like horse and buggy in Krakow, Poland, to like calling me on her cell phone. What?
Right. That is so true. Okay. So retrograde.
Yeah.
I hate retrograde. And it seems like,
Most of the sky is retrograde at the moment.
yeah. And it seems like we're always in. I have a friend and she doesn't do anything a few days before retrograde or a few days after.
Because every planet, other than the sun and moon can't go retrograde, but all of the other planets go retrograde. And so Mercury goes retrograde with the most frequency. It's for about 3 weeks every 3 months.
Okay,
that's how the math breaks down. It's currently retrograde.
Okay,
the end of July, right? The 31st it goes direct.
Then is it the 31st? Because I was looking last night and I think it said August 2nd. So is it?
No, here. It's the 31st.
Here, as in the city, or this on what?
In the States.
Okay.
Because it's at like 10 o'clock at night.
Uh-huh.
So most what's called ephemerises, which are the books or tables that calculate astrology, and then people add or subtract hours based on their time zone, are set on British time.
Okay.
So it is the 1st of August in the UK.
Okay.
But we're 5 hours behind.
Okay.
Right. So it's the 31st here.
Gotcha.
In the US anyway. So what's happening during any retrograde is it's when the planet gets the closest it does to Earth in its orbit. Right? Like it's orbiting of the sun. It's the closest it gets.
So in this case, the closest Mercury gets.
Right. So with Mercury retrograde, it's orbiting the sun. We're orbiting the sun, and sometimes we're closer because the orbits aren't exactly round, right? They're perpendicular. They are more like egg-shaped, right? And Mercury moves at a different speed than the Earth because it's closer to the sun.
Meaning faster?
Yeah.
Yeah,
it moves faster than the Earth because it's closer to the sun. So it's a smaller circle. So basically, like for every one time around the sun that the Earth takes, it's like 3-4 times for Mercury. Right? It's going 4 times as fast. But so as it gets close, the closest it gets to Earth is when it appears to be moving backwards. Which is what retrograde is.
And that's because, I mean, not that it matters,
but... So if you think about it, of like if you're driving on the freeway and you're passing an 18-wheeler and it feels like you're going backwards.
Yes.
That's retrograde.
I just realized that as you were saying that, because there are moments I could be in a parked car and then all of a sudden I have like this illusion that I'm moving.
Yes.
So, okay.
So that's what a retrograde is when it creates the optical illusion that from our perspective on Earth, Mercury is moving backwards through the sky.
Okay.
Because of its proximity to the Earth. And when in truth, we're still both going around the sun. But it appears that Mercury is suddenly going backwards. And so Mercury is the god of communication in mythology, right? He was Hermes in Greek mythology. So it governs how we think, how we communicate, what we communicate. Now they also attribute Mercury a lot to technology too, because that's a form of communication. Travel too. So it's like, that's why it's often ill-advised to like book tickets during Mercury retrograde because you tend to have problems with your travel. So part of what happens, why Mercury retrograde is sort of notorious for breakdowns in communication or breakdowns in computers die or, flights get rerouted all over the country, is that energy of Mercury, of communication, is super amplified because the planet's closer to Earth. And that creates a breakdown in communication because there's so much focus and energy on it that it leads to missteps. It leads to breakdowns in communication. Because it is retrograde so much of the year, right? It's about like 20% of the population is born under a Mercury retrograde. We can't, in modern times, we can't just sort of like cease doing all things.
Right?
So it's finding ways to navigate that. There are things that are beneficial to do during Mercury retrograde because what the energy is asking of us is to rethink. I sort of think whatever planet is retrograde, putting the prefix re in front of it. And that's what's being asked of us, right? So Mercury is about thinking, communication. So you rethink, you recommunicate under Mercury retrograde. So that's where it's a great time to edit. It's a great time to brainstorm. It's a great time to go back over things you've already been thinking about or talking about because it's like, oh, well, it wasn't complete. There is something that didn't get communicated previously. that you're having to revisit.
So that's why it's a good idea, not only because of miscommunication, but is that why it's a good idea to not necessarily start something new?
Yep.
Because the focus should be on...
Is more reflective and internal. And so it's hard. The energy isn't going outward, it's going inward. And so it's really part of why things break down during Mercury retrograde. It's like, well, if you're trying to force, it's like, swim upriver. It's like you're forcing energy outward. And it's not the time
for that.
Yeah.
It's not the time.
And, we live in times where sometimes you don't have a choice. And so there can be ways of, okay, they say, well, it's not advised to sign a contract under Mercury retrograde, right? That's part of that starting something. Sometimes you don't have a choice.
Right.
And so ways of doing that is like, well, having caveats. Maybe it's like, oh, well, you're renegotiating in 6 months. Right. And so that's why, well, if there was something that you want to be very different, you get an opportunity to go back and change it. And so padding yourself sort of.
Yeah. And when you said focused energy, there's focused energy on communication. Does that mean it's just the power of Mercury? Is that what you mean by focused?
Yeah, because the planet's physically closer to the Earth, then it's
more of a magnitude.
More intense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
As part of how to think about it.
And so how can we think to not be afraid of Mercury? Yeah.
So, some of it is you can prepare.
Right?
So like ahead of time. So a good 10 days before Mercury goes retrograde, back up your computer. Right. That way, if it does break, at least you've got backups. Right. So, that can help. And putting the energy, it is asking something of us, right? That it is asking us to review, to edit. So putting your energy into what is beneficial at that time often helps mitigate other things from manifesting. Because it's like you're working with the energy instead of fighting it. Right.
So what's your sign? What's your ascendant? What's your descendant?
So I have a Cancer sun.
So you just had a birthday?
Yeah.
Oh, happy birthday.
Thank you. And Sagittarius rising. And Moon in Virgo. And then my descendant is Gemini because I have a Sagittarius ascendant.
Okay. Gemini is another sign I don't know. I don't really understand a lot.
So Gemini is a descendant. In partnership, I lead with my intellect, right? And so having partners, it's like, if there isn't a meeting of the minds, it's not worth my time. If we can't talk till 2 o'clock in the morning, I don't bother. And then, so
you're a rising Sagittarius, and that means what in your case?
So as a Cancer sun, so home, family, nurturing, that's my sort of core being. Caretaker, right? I'm in nurturing in the healing arts as a profession.
Do you present opposite to that a little bit?
Yeah, I've been a preschool teacher. I've worked with children, but the Sagittarius is optimistic, is adventurous, is philosophically oriented, and sort of always thinking down the road. Right? I'm always thinking like, one of my challenges can be like, well, I have my 10-year plan, but I don't know what I'm doing next week.
Yeah.
So that, and Sagittarius as an ascendant too. Yeah, it's like I'm sort of happiest if I'm traveling. I've moved a lot in my life. I've lived in like 8 different states. I have never lived in the same building for more than 4 years since I was 10.
Wow.
Because it's like, I'm always, even if I'm in the same city, I move. And so, that sort of constant itch to travel, to go elsewhere.
Well, you live in Serenbe and in Georgia, and share with the listeners what Serenbe is like.
So Serenbe, I call it an intentional town. And it really is becoming, we may actually become annexed at some point. But so it's a development community, but it is a development community. It's about 25 minutes south of the Atlanta airport. And it is very eco-conscious, arts-focused. So they have, I think at this point, almost 1,500 acres. Originally it was 1,000. And with this idea that 70% of the land will never be developed.
Mm.
And so they build in this way where it's really dense development and then nature, and really dense development and nature. And so almost nobody really has a backyard because we have
it's all around
700 acres to play with.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's this, they have different sort of, they call them hamlets, that within the development, there's sort of these sub neighborhoods that are different themes. And so some are health and nutrition focused, and they just opened a new restaurant there, and that's where the day spa is, and the yoga studio just moved there. And there's going to be a chiropractor there, and that's sort of like health and wellness focused. And then there's an arts focus of another hamlet that's where they do, you know, there's a gallery and more focused with arts. And then there's a organic CSA, so a community agricultural farm. And that's another neighborhood that's focused more on food. And so in Grange, in that neighborhood, all of the sidewalks are lined with edible bushes and trees, right? So it's like, oh, there's blueberries instead of flowers by the sidewalk. And so this time of year, it's like you can just walk down the sidewalk and pick fresh blueberries. And so I think the community was started by a family, maybe 15 years ago or something now.
And you have an establishment there?
I live there right now. Yeah, I ended up out here in Georgia. I have a good friend from college when I lived in Santa Barbara, who she and her husband and their daughter had moved out here from Santa Barbara. And they had moved to Serenbe, and I came out to visit. And at the time I was living in Seattle, and there's a closed private Facebook group of all of our neighbors of our community. And she had just put on the community Facebook page, oh, my friend Dr. Laura Tad, psychological astrologer, is coming. If anybody wants a reading, let me know. And I worked with 10 people in 3 days.
No kidding.
And just went,
you said, this is the place for me.
What?
Yeah.
Whereas as much as there's a vibrant astrology community in Seattle, and it's a lot of what drew me there, nothing was opening there. No doors were opening. I just hit sort of wall after wall and tried to get a teaching position at the university. And I was pending with department for 6 months. I was in the second round of interviews, and came out to Serenbe to visit them, and just stuff was just falling at my feet. Opportunities just opening and opening and opening. And so nothing was really keeping me in Seattle. I'd only been there for 2 years and moved across the country. And it's active. Serenbe is actively growing. And it was just in O Magazine in March.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
And it's about 45 minutes away from Metro Atlanta. Is that right?
Yep.
And so you must really love it to stay there and not want to be closer into Atlanta.
Yeah, I mean, it's like everywhere. It's got its pluses and minuses.
Yeah.
But so within the community, so there's an inn that's there. There are now 5 restaurants. There's an elementary school. So it's active. That's where it's sort of like it's becoming more and more of a town. And so that helps to not feel like we're quite as isolated as you can, even though it's 20 minutes from the airport, it's in the woods. So it can feel, like you're in a bubble and you don't want to leave.
Right.
It's like, oh, but I can walk to the general store in the community and get something, or I can deal with Atlanta traffic. So yeah, I mean, I'm enjoying it. I'm as I said, I move a lot, so we'll see how long.
And you've been there about 2.5 years?
2.5 years, yeah.
Okay. Well, before I ask you the healing questions that I like to ask every guest, I've been so curious and wanting to ask you about Greek mythology, as we've talked about the planets, and just can you speak to the reality of the mythology versus a story? I don't know if that Do you understand what I mean?
Well, I think I see them as the same thing. A myth is a story to me.
Mm-hmm.
That I think today the word myth has not really understood. Like, so a myth isn't a falsehood, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is how it's often thought of today. But that a myth is a universal story.
That started, but does that mean it's true? So is it Mercury that represents Hermes? How do I
Well, they're the
pronounce?
same. Hermes and Mercury are the same. One is the Roman version. Mercury is the Roman god of communication. Hermes is the Greek god of communication.
Okay. So they're one and the
So
same.
They're largely interchangeable.
Okay.
So, I mean, were there the physical beings that are gods?
Mm-hmm.
It's debatable.
Right.
Right? I mean, chances are Aphrodite was not born, a real woman wasn't birthed out of the sea in a shell. Right? Chances are that didn't actually happen. But stories, myths are used to explain real phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the story of Demeter and Persephone in Greek mythology explains a lot, but part of what it explains is the seasons.
Mm-hmm.
Because when Persephone is captured and brought to the underworld by Hades, and her mother Demeter, who is a goddess of the earth, is in such grief, the world is plummeted into an ice age. Right? And then with gods negotiating, it's finally agreed, okay, she has to spend half the year, Persephone's in the underworld half the year, and above in this world the other half. And that's the seasons. When she's gone, Demeter's in grief, and it's winter, and it's cold, and things die. And when she returns, we have spring and summer. Right? And so it's real and not. Right? I mean, the mythology is used to explain real phenomena.
Because we need to put words to things as humans, as human beings. We need to put words to things to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. You know, you tell a small child a story, right, to explain why they should act a certain way. It's the same thing.
Right. And nevertheless, right? It's a story,
the boy who cried wolf. Right. Well, maybe that there's a kid who, 500 years ago who kept saying there was a wolf, then there wasn't. Sure, that could have happened. Kids are snarky. But the reason it's still told is to convey the importance of honesty.
Yeah.
Right. And so particularly with myth, with Greek, Roman, a lot of it is that it's evolved over millennia. So the Greeks took a lot of their mythology from the Babylonians. It's older than, a lot of the stories are older than what we think of as Greek myth. And the Romans took the Greek stories and altered it to fit their culture. And particularly with the Greeks, it gets confusing to some extent because a lot of it also came from Egypt. And yet, because Greece invaded Egypt, and Alexandria was the capital of Greece for a while, even though it's in Egypt today, everything was being written in Greek, even though it was being written in Egypt. Right? Geographically, they were in Egypt, but the Greeks were were ruling, so the Greek was the state language. Right? So people were writing in Greek, but they were in Egypt, so it could have very easily been Egyptians telling these stories. And it could have been Egyptian mythology that we just don't know how much of it.
But the thing is that they're true in terms of the phenomena. They're not just stories that have been carried on through the centuries.
Yeah, they were all, there was a reason for all of them. They were there to explain, to make sense of the world. Right? It was their religion to some extent. And the reason spirituality, religion, mythology, all of this exists is we're trying to make sense of what it means to be human.
Right.
And that's the path, that's the lens.
Right.
That they saw the world through.
And so from the in India, you said Vedic
Yeah.
astrology. And so what is that? And then does that
So
does that
it-
contradict the
No.
way we perceive astrology?
No, and there's a lot of overlap, but it's calculated differently. So that's where it gets confusing, because even language-wise, there's a lot of overlap.
Mm-hmm.
They have the same signs. They have houses, but they draw a square chart instead of a round chart, which is what you use in Western astrology. Typically, historically, they don't use anything past Saturn in Vedic astrology, because they're only using what you can see with the naked eye. The major difference in how it's calculated is that in Western astrology, the zodiac begins with the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, right? So the first day of Aries is the first day of spring in the northern hemisphere in Western astrology. And in Vedic astrology, the first day of Aries is when the sun rises with the constellation Aries.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not lined up. It's about a sign off.
Okay.
And so that's where, if you're a Taurus in Western astrology, unless you're born at the very, very end of Taurus, you're an Aries in Vedic astrology.
So maybe the details might be different, but would the bottom line, would the message that I might get from you if I was born here be the same from as the message I might get from if I was born?
Well, there's Vedic astrologers in the U.S.
Okay.
For sure.
Okay.
I have friends that practice Vedic astrology. What I would say is in terms of the calculation, it's done differently.
Uh-huh.
The other thing that is often very different is typically Vedic astrology is more fate-oriented and doesn't bring in free will to the same extent.
Okay.
It's more predictive and more fate-oriented. And for me, I'm more psychologically oriented, so there's a lot more gray area in how I approach it.
Okay.
But so often, there's a lot less wiggle room in Vedic astrology.
Okay.
But it's an active part of Indian culture still. Arranged marriages are still a common thing based on astrology.
Oh, really?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, I don't know if a lot of us know that.
And in India, I had a woman, the esthetician I used to go to when I lived in San Francisco was from Bangladesh, and she and her husband were an arranged marriage based on their astrology, and she's 40, so still going on
and happy.
Yeah. Well, wow. And at least how she explained it was that it was not going to be a really easy marriage, but it was an important marriage. So it's been a really growthful relationship. It hasn't always been simple, right? But it's been what was important for each of them. And, and that's part of when I work with clients who are couples and looking at it, it's like, well, you want some difficult aspects between the two charts. You want some tension, because if there's no tension, there's no growth, and then there's no longevity.
Right.
And so you need some of that, because otherwise it just, it fades pretty quickly.
It's boring.
Yeah. And what are you doing?
Right. And
particularly in intimate relationships, some of that is where the sexual tension is. If there isn't any tension, then you don't want each other.
Yeah, no. Like I said, it's boring.
Yeah.
Okay, so how would you describe your knowing or perception of God?
Well, for me, I would use more of the term spirit or spiritual, but it's one of those things where it's like, you don't know till you know. I never, when I work with clients, it's like I never try to convince people to believe anything. It's like it's your own experience.
But for you personally, for Laura, you don't know until you know.
Yeah. It can be like a specific event.
Yeah.
It can be an experience that I've had. It can be that sense of connectedness, or just there's it's expansiveness. I mean, to use like chakra language, right? It's like this opening of the crown and third eye.
Can you recall a time or that you're willing to share when you really felt the presence of spirit, of the divine in you?
Yeah, well, I think my Uncle Gary's funeral, it was palpable. It's like, I think he was there. And there was just in the midst of sort of, he'd been sick, so it wasn't unexpected, but there was this sort of like lightness to it, of like in the midst of the grief, feeling expanded. And grateful, like being able to really access that gratitude that he wasn't suffering.
Wow. And feel his presence at the same time.
Yeah.
Wow. What do you think God calls you to do for yourself and others through your work? Or the divine. I want to respect
I think, definitely being in a place of helping in other people. And within that, and this goes into some of the other work I'm doing right now, but helping people recognize and access their own resiliency. That we are so much stronger and so much more capable than we often believe ourselves to be. And because the world tells us no, or our childhood, or, whatever, we have that narrative that we can't, and we're so much more capable than we believe ourselves to be. And so I think too, for myself, it's like, that's my big work, is recognizing my own capability and what I'm able to contribute, and that what I have to contribute is of value. And not, sometimes I can get lost in that, right? So I'm saying like, well, what am I really doing at the end of the day? How am I really saving the world? Look at how awful things are right now. How is like talking to somebody about astrology in any way preventing the camps on the border, right? And having to just say, okay, right, but that's my piece, and who knows who I work with that may be influential at a level that I'm not. And so my working with them allows them to be more influential to somebody who is more, and that whole domino effect.
Right.
So but I think that piece of like, our own resiliency.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So is there a time when something occurred in your life that was just it was a miracle or a blessing, and it had nothing to do with your doing? You knew that was definitely spirit that did that for you?
Yeah, there's a few. So part of it brings in my mom and her abilities. And when I was 8 or 9, I think it was my 9th birthday, I almost choked to death on my 9th birthday.
Really?
And earlier that day, we had been having lunch at a restaurant. My mom, it was, the 80s, so she had to go to a payphone to call my dad to make sure he had gotten something. And it kept the phone, again, it was early 80s, so the phone kept being busy. So she kept having to stand there trying to get through. And on the opposite wall from the phone was a poster on the Heimlich maneuver. And so my mom kept reading this poster while she was trying to get the call to go through. And then fast forward, later in the day, it was my birthday party. And
this was at home, or where were you?
Home. Yep. So we were at home, and I was at my party, and somebody had told a joke, and I had just taken a sip of soda, so I tried to swallow because I was about to come out my nose, and I tried to swallow, and it went down my windpipe. And my memory of it is I calmly got up from the table, walked into the kitchen, and tapped my mom on the shoulder, and apparently I was blue because I was not breathing. And she did the Heimlich maneuver, and a teaspoon of soda came out, and I was fine. But that was absolutely sort of divine intervention. Because even the calmness that I had, again, that idea of sort of presence and calm, it was like no thought. I didn't have any panic. I didn't come running in and say, oh, I can't breathe.
Right.
You know, I calmly got up, walked in the kitchen, tapped her on the shoulder.
Hey, by the way. Wow.
You know, and all the kids at my party were terrified. They all were like freaking out. And I was like totally calm.
What did your mom say about it?
Yeah, I mean, she felt like spirit had intervened and made sure that she knew what to do and that she had seen that poster. And so that she just went into automatic pilot and she didn't panic. She just went into automatic pilot and hadn't known the Heimlich maneuver prior to earlier that day.
Where were you all? Where was she earlier that day when she was trying to reach your dad? At a restaurant.
Yeah. At a payphone. And she was, you know, at a restaurant, often they'll have that posted. And so it was the opposite wall of the phone. So she just kept reading it because she had a busy signal. And so she knew what to do. And absolutely. I mean, I would have, now when I, you know, work with kids, I'm like, yeah, if you can make sound, you're not choking. Like you're fine. It's like your body is able to get it. It's like, yeah, I'll check, I'll help, but you really can't. When you're really choking, you cannot get air in or out of your body.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I've had that experience. I used to suffer from acid reflux, and so there were many times that I would choke. And one time it's like my father saved my life by just picking me up, and he didn't even get that far. He just kept pounding on me, you know? Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely, you know, there's been
that's wonderful.
That's definitely one of the more dramatic ones.
Wow. Well, so I usually ask people if they're a healer or a seeker or both. And I think of you as a healer. Do you see yourself as both, as one more than the other? Or?
Both. I think you don't spend like your whole 30s in grad school
being
a seeker. Always looking to understand, right? And make sense of the world. And it's part of what I love about astrology is it helps me understand what's going on. It's like, right, it's been a really funky month. Well, because I'm an astrologer and I can go, we had 2 eclipses and Mercury is retrograde, so it's just weird. You know, that helps me navigate it because I'm like, this too shall pass.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, okay, we're done with eclipses for a while. Mercury, a couple more days and Mercury goes direct. It'll ease up. So both for sure.
So both.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think because with the healing work, then the seeking feeds that, right? It's always evolving. It's like my work, how I work is not stagnant. It is continually evolving.
Right.
Because I seek.
And do you do appointments in person and on the phone or?
Yeah. So in person, I'm at the spa at Serenbe.
Is that what it's called? The spa at Serenbe?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I also work remotely over the phone or Skype.
Okay.
Because I've got clients all over the world, so I've got to have sort of international ways of folks getting in touch with me.
What's the best way for someone to get in touch with you? Email or voicemail?
So my website, you can email me through my website.
Which is
mythicsky.com. So like we were talking about myth.
So
yeah, mythicsky.com.
Okay. All right. Well, is there anything else that you think would be great to know?
I think it's probably good for now. We're on the other side of these eclipses. So.
Well, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Remember, you can listen to all of our episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and our podcast YouTube channel. Remember also to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and send me that email at letstarthealingpodcast@gmail.com. Let's start healing.